This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
This is the TED Radio Hour. Each week, groundbreaking TED Talks.
TED Talks.
TED.
Technology.
Entertainment.
Design.
Is that really what it stands for? I've never known that.
Delivered at TED conferences around the world.
It's the gift of the human imagination.
We've had to believe in impossible things.
The true nature of reality beckons from just beyond.
Those talks, those ideas, adapted for radio. From NPR. I'm Guy Raz. Coming up,
that line between good and evil, which people like to think is fixed and impermeable, I knew that line was movable and it was permeable.
Even though he held loaded guns to my head, I never once thought of myself as a battered wife.
Everybody potentially is a killer, but some of us are potentially more than others.
The violence within us. First News. It's the TED Radio Hour from NPR. I'm Guy Raz, and on the show today, we're going to hear from TED speakers who are all defined in some way by thinking about or even experiencing violence. And at some point, they've all asked the question you've probably asked as well, the question of whether somewhere hidden deep inside is the capacity to commit violence. So let's start with some old audio tape that we came across a few weeks ago.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Prison study, August the 18th.
This is an old recording made in August of 1971. And the man on the tape...
My name is Phil Zimbardo. I'm a professor of psychology here.
Phil Zimbardo was a young professor at Stanford at the time when he made this recording.
I will work on being concise, which is not my long suit.
And this is Phil now, when we interviewed him a few weeks ago.
I am a psychologist. I just retired recently from Stanford University, where I taught for 40 years, and before that...
Anyway, the reason we got in touch with Phil Zimbardo was because of this experiment he did at Stanford 40 years ago. And he wanted to explore this really controversial question, a question with no clear answer.
What makes people go wrong?
And in his TED Talk, Phil Zimbardo tried to answer it.
I asked this question when I was a little kid. When I was a kid growing up in the South Bronx, inner city ghetto in New York, I was surrounded by evil. And I had friends who were really good kids who lived out the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde scenario of Robert Louis Stevenson. That is, they took drugs, got in trouble, went to jail, some got killed. And some did it without drug assistance. That line between good and evil, which privileged people like to think is fixed and impermeable, with them on the good side and the others on the bad side, I knew that line was immovable and it was permeable. Good people could be seduced across that line. In rare circumstances, bad kids could recover with help, with reform, with rehabilitation. And that tells us several things. One, the world will always be filled with good and evil, because good and evil is the yin and yang of the human condition. It tells me something else, if you remember. God's favorite angel was Lucifer. Apparently, he disobeyed God. And so Lucifer descends into hell, becomes Satan, becomes the devil. The force of evil in the universe begins. So this arc of the cosmic transformation of God's favorite angel into the devil, for me, sets the context for understanding human beings who are transformed from good, ordinary people into perpetrators of evil.
Let me start officially then.
And that takes us back to Phil Zimbardo's story. Stanford, 1971.
My name is Phil Zimbardo.
Remember, at the time, Phil was a young professor of psychology at Stanford. And he recorded an audio diary of an experiment. Okay, now, before I go on, I should say that the next 7 minutes or so of the show have a few pretty disturbing moments, but important to hear if you want to understand what Phil Zimbardo set out to prove. Anyway, to do the experiment, he needed volunteers.
And these people answered an ad I put in the city newspaper, wanted college students for a study of prison life. That would last up to 2 weeks.
And the students would live and work in a mock prison in the basement of Stanford's psychology department just to see how it might change them. So Phil got about 24 students together.
Who were the most normal, most healthy physically, psychologically.
No history of crime, none of them violent.
And then I randomly assigned them. Half is going to be guards, half are going to be prisoners. The ones who are going to be prisoners are going to live there 24/7. The guards are going to work 8-hour shifts.
So here's some tape of Phil during an orientation for his 12 guards. And he's explaining what's about to happen to the 12 other students, the ones picked to be the prisoners.
So what's going to happen tomorrow is we told the students to wait in their houses or rooms where they're living. Squad car is going to pull up.
A squad car was going to show up at some unexpected time at their houses.
Did they know they were going to be prisoners?
No. We simply said at that point, wait at home. The study will begin this weekend.
So the next day, here's a description of what happened. And the voice you're going to hear on this whole recording belongs to one of Phil's volunteers. This volunteer was known as Prisoner 8612.
Police car pulls up in front, and a cop comes to the front door, knocks, and says he's looking for me.
And says, is Billy Whitlow there? And the mother says, here's Billy. He says, Billy Whitlow, you wanted for violation of Penal Code 456, whatever. You have the right to remain silent, reads the Miranda rights.
So they took me out the door, they put my hands against the car.
And drives them to the station, photographed them, fingerprinted them, and put them in a holding cell.
They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit.
And now they're blindfolded. They don't know where they're going. They simply bring them down to the basement of the Stanford psychology department, strip them naked, and then take the blindfold off. And they're standing naked, and the guards are all around, humiliating them. And then we put them in a humiliating uniform, which is really a smock with numbers on, to reduce their individuality. You're essentially anonymous. You are a number. You are a number. You are a number. And we have a chain on one foot to remind them at all times of their lowly position. Number. You are a number. You are a number. See, the whole point, I wanted the authorities to take away their freedom. So then once you're in my prison, only the authorities give it back to you. The other thing is, we bug the cells. And at first, it's 1971. These are hippies. They were not taking it serious. They're laughing, kidding. The problem was, on the morning of the second day, the prisoners rebelled. They ripped off their numbers. They took off the stocking caps. They barricaded themselves in their cells. They didn't want to be dehumanized. And they made a mistake. They started cursing the guards from the safety of their cells. And the guards came to me and said, what are we going to do? I said, it's your prison. What do you want to do? And the key was, the guards then said, these are dangerous prisoners. We have to show them who is in control.
Pushing his ass around. We told him to do push-ups.
And they broke down the doors. They stripped all the prisoners naked.
They're not push-ups. They're not push-ups.
And I said, no physical force. But I didn't limit psychological force.
Prisoners must eat at meal times and only at meal times. Prisoners must eat at meal times and only at meal times.
Each day that passed, the guards would find new ways to humiliate the prisoners. For example, on one of the days, one of the prisoners had a birthday, and the guards made the other prisoners sing happy birthday. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times, the same song, using only that prisoner's identification number.
Happy birthday.
Imagine doing this completely naked, blindfolded, with total strangers for 36 hours.
And what happened within 36 hours, the student who was the ringleader of the rebellion, prison 8612, had an emotional breakdown.
Damn it! Tough! You don't know! I mean, God! I just can't take it.
Screaming, crying, irrational thinking.
Tough! I don't know how to explain it. All up inside! Out! Out now!
And I had to release him, But obviously I thought, well, we made a mistake in our selection procedure. He must have been, in quote, defective. The problem was each day thereafter, another prisoner broke down in a similar fashion.
This made those men who were pretending to be guards in their uniforms, it kind of made them sadistic.
Oh, no, there's no question about it. I mean, one of the powerful motivations for evil is boredom. You are a guard. You have 9-hour shifts, especially on the night shift. This was even worse at the prison in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, where guards had 12-hour shifts. And what do you do to relieve boredom? You have to do something exciting, something novel, something different. And the problem is, with men on men, it always goes in the sexual dimension. And this is exactly what happened in the prison in Abu Ghraib, making them simulate in Abu Ghraib fellatio. In my study, the guards got the prisoners to simulate sodomy within 5 days.
So how do psychologists go about understanding such transformations of human character if you believe that they were good soldiers before they went down to the dungeon? People are the actors on the stage, but you'll have to be aware of what the situation is. Who are the cast of characters? What's the costume? Is there a stage director? And so we're interested in what are the external factors around the individual, the bad barrel. Does it make a difference if warriors go to battle, changing their appearance or not? Does it make a difference if they're anonymous in how they treat their victims? We know in some cultures they go to war, they don't change appearance. In other cultures, they paint themselves like Lord of the Flies. Anthropologist John Watson found 23 cultures that had 2 bits of data. If they don't change their appearance, only 1 of 8 kills, torture, mutilate. The key is in the red zone. If they change their appearance, 12 of 13, that's 90%, kill, torture, mutilate. And that's the power of anonymity. The power is in the system. The system creates the situation that corrupts the individuals. The system is the legal, political, economic, cultural background. And this is where the power is of the bad barrel makers. So you want to change a person, you got to change the situation. You want to change the situation, you got to know where the power is in the system.
So where was the power in the Stanford prison? Well, it was with Phil Zimbardo. And one night, his girlfriend, who was a PhD student at the time, she came to visit him in the lab. And she saw the guards doing horrible things to the prisoners.
And she says, it's terrible what you're doing to those boys. They're not prisoners, they're not guards, they're boys, and you're responsible. And I'm saying, don't you see how incredible this is? This is human nature in vitro. And then she stops me cold and says, if this is the real you, I don't think I want to continue my relationship with you. The situation has changed you.
Was that true?
That's the whole point, is that I was transformed into being the prison superintendent. That was the shocker. That was like shaking me down and saying, think about who you are. And I stepped back and I said, you're right. I have to end the study.
But you're saying that all of us have the capacity to do evil, to commit violence.
All of us. No, see, but the key is, that's what makes the study of human nature so fascinating. We are blessed with this incredible brain, which gives rise to this even more dynamic mind, which gives us the possibility to do the most wonderful, kind things and the most awful, cruel things, to be caring or indifferent. And it pushes some of us to be villains, to do horrible things, to be perpetrators of evil. But in every one of those evil situations, there's always some people who are able to step back and do the right thing.
Stanford psychologist Phil Zimbardo. You can find all of his TED Talks, including the one you heard here, at TED.com. By the way, Phil's girlfriend, who stopped the study?
So I had to deal with this affront to my authority, and the best way I could deal with it is I married her, actually a year later, in the Stanford Chapel.
They celebrated their 40th anniversary last year in that same chapel.
But the Stanford Chapel is actually not far from the Stanford prison that I created.
I'm Guy Raz. This episode, The Violence Within Us. More TED Radio Hour in 1 minute from NPR. It's the TED Radio Hour from NPR. I'm Guy Raz. And on today's show, the violence within us. And for some people, it's actually possible to measure it, to see violence in a brain scan, like for James H. Fallon.
When you go to parties, do you normally say James H. Fallon?
I just say Jim.
Oh, you say Jim, okay.
That's to differentiate me from that crackpot Jimmy Fallon.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, Jim is a neuroscientist at the University of California at Irvine. And his story wasn't all that different from other researchers who study brains. That is, until he discovered something that really was inside of him. And he told this story in his TED Talk.
I study behavior, but on the basis of everything from genes through neurotransmitters, dopamine, things like that, all the way through circuit analysis. So that's what I normally do. But then, for some reason, I got into something else just recently. And it all grew out of one of my colleagues asked me to analyze a bunch of brains of psychopathic killers.
So every so often, a little like in the movie Silence of the Lambs, psychopathic murderers would be wheeled into Jim's lab at UC Irvine.
Right. Maybe once every 6 months or so, there'd be a SWAT team that would show up with the guy in manacles, and they'd do PET scans on him. And what my colleagues would say is, take a look at this. What do you see? And the thing I do, normally is to look for patterns and things. And so I would look for what areas of the brain were off.
And here's just to give you the pattern. And the pattern is that those people, every one of them I looked at who was a murderer and who was a serial killer, had damage to their orbital cortex, which is right above the eyes, the orbits. And also the anterior part of the temporal lobe. So there's this pattern that every one of them had, but they all were a little different too. They had other sorts of brain damage. And how you end up with a psychopath and a killer depends on exactly when the damage occurs. It's really a very precisely timed thing. You get different kinds of psychopaths on the basis of genetics and brain damage and the interaction with environment and exactly how that machine works.
Nature and nurture. And when those two things are in perfect balance, Jim says there's one thing that can set it all off.
The key thing is called the MAOA gene. And there's a variant of this gene that is in the normal population. Some of you have this. And it has to do with too much serotonin during development. It's kind of interesting because serotonin is supposed to make you calm and relaxed. But if you have this gene in utero, your brain is bathed in this, so your whole brain becomes insensitive to serotonin, so it doesn't work, later on. And it's sex-linked. It's on the X chromosome. And so in this way, you can only get it from your mother. And in fact, this is probably why mostly men, boys, are psychopathic killers, are very aggressive. Because, the daughter can get one X from the father, one X from the mother. It's kind of diluted out. But for a son, he could only get the X chromosome from his mother. So this is how it's passed from mother to son. Theoretically, what this means is that in order to express this gene in a violent way, very early on, before puberty, you have to be involved in something that's really traumatic. Not a little stress, not being spanked or something, but really seeing violence or being involved in it in 3D. Right? This is how the mirror neuron system works. And so if you have that gene and you see a lot of violence in a certain situation, this is the recipe for disaster. Absolute disaster.
It was a pretty fascinating discovery. The violence gene might be passed from mother to son. And then, a short time later, Jim got a call from his mother.
My mother said to me, I hear you've been going around talking about psychopathic killers. And you're talking as if you come from a normal family. I said, what the hell are you talking about? She then told me about her own family tree. Now, she blamed this on my father's side, of course. This was one of these cases because she has no violence in her background. But my father did. Well, she said there's good news and bad news. One of your cousins is Ezra Cornell, founded Cornell University. But the bad news is that your cousin's also Lizzie Borden.
Lizzie Borden, the one who took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks.
One hot day in Old Fall River, Mr. Andrew Borden died, and they booked his daughter Lizzie on a charge of homicide.
So you got the Lizzie Borden chromosome.
I got the Lizzie plus.
But they all agree Miss Lizzie B was quite a problem kid.
Okay, So what? You know, we have Lizzie.
That kind of thing just isn't very nice.
She goes, no, it gets worse. Read this book. And here's this Killed Strangely, and it's a historical book. And the first murder of a mother by a son was my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Okay, so that's the first case of matricide, but it doesn't stop there. There were 7 more men on my father's side that were all murderers, okay? Now, this, gives one a little pause, because my father himself and my 3 uncles in World War II were all conscientious objectors. They're all pussycats. But every once in a while, Lizzie Borden, like 3 times a century, and we're kind of due. And and we had to take action. Now, our kids found out about it, and they all seem to be okay, but our grandkids are going to be kind of concerned here. So what we've done is I started to do PET scans of everybody in the family. And we started to do PET scans, EEGs, and genetic analysis to see where the bad news is. But there's going to be bad news somewhere, and we don't know where it's going to pop up. So that's right there.
Wait a minute, that can't be it. I mean, that can't be everything. There has to be more to the story, Jim.
Well, after the TED Talk, over the next year and a half, I had more tests done.
On you?
On myself. EEGs and, different kinds of imaging, but also further genetic tests. And these came back even worse, as it were. That is, it showed that I had even more genetics related to violence and lack of empathy.
Wait, like you were potentially a murderer?
I'm not a murderer.
No, right, of course
and
not.
I'm not a criminal, and yet I've got what appears to be all the elements except early abuse.
You have the same kind of brain as the ones you studied.
Yeah, my brain looks like probably the worst killers I looked at, the worst psychopaths.
Wow.
The thing is, I don't have other brain damage. The top of my brain, where all the cognition is, the cold cognition in executive function, is hyperfunctioning. It could mean that I'd be a really mastermind murderer if I was a murderer, because my executive skills are quite good, and you can really see it in my brain patterns.
So what explains the fact that you're not, that you're a peaceful guy?
Well, my parents and my extended family, my aunts and uncles and grandparents, treated me with particularly kid gloves, wonderfully from the time I was born. And I think that had a lot to do with it. I never thought that environment played a role like that at all. And this really changed my mind the past couple of years, so I've had to eat some crow.
I mean, does it ever kind of freak you out that you have that inside of you?
It's made me wonder. It really has. I thought I knew who I was. But it's only after the TED Talk and over, especially the last year and a half, I found out other things about what people think about me, people very close. And I've told them, please be honest. And what I heard was not so great.
What'd you hear?
Well, I think I'm warm to people and I'm quite cold. And I don't do the things I think the average person does. I don't take care of the people around me in the way I should. And I just do things that you wouldn't want to be married to me. You might not want to completely depend on me. If I have a choice between going to a funeral for my aunt or uncle and going to a party that popped up that day, I'm at the party. I don't do the things you're supposed to do. There's a lot of that stuff. And frankly, it's not things that are criminal, right? And you don't want to hurt people. So there are a number of things that I have that are considered psychopathic.
Has that discovery about yourself changed you?
After I found out what people thought about me, I really didn't care.
Wow.
Which was kind of the proof that they were right about me. Because I don't, at a very fundamental level, I don't care. But I'm trying to. Like, I know I should be doing this. So I'm trying to retrain myself into caring. So that's how I'm handling it, just by knowing that I should be doing certain things and trying to do them.
You're like your best research subject.
As it turns out, yes. I've been forced to look at myself, which I never did before. And the hints were there all along. I just refused to put them together into the story that it is. And I always had kind of whitewashed or sugar-coated my behavior. And people around you help you do that. They go, oh, you're just being a boy. You're just being a kid. You're just being a wild man. And so I took those sorts of responses from people and from myself as, oh, that's just fun. And when people tell you, oh, you're crazy, you can be told that 100 times in your life. But there's another way of looking at those statements and who's saying it and under what circumstance. And you can either listen to it and put them all together to get the correct story or not. And I always suppress that.
We just heard from Phil Zimbardo, the psychologist, and he says, anyone is capable of violence. I mean, anyone could carry it out. Do you think that's true?
There are many genes that control these things, the aggression and the violence and probably the desire and willingness to get even with people, retribution, but also empathy. All of these things, it's a roll of the dice. We're in the genetic casino. There's 100 dice, and they can come up millions of different ways. That means that everybody is on a different part of the spectrum. And so on this spectrum of violence, there are some people who are they're born with very violent tendencies. It doesn't make them criminals, and they become what we call pro-social psychopaths. That is, they can use it to do great things. But I think, some people are just so mellow that they inherit all these very low violence genes that theoretically they can get violent, but it's almost never going to happen. They have to be pushed so far. So the answer is yes, everybody potentially is a killer, but some of us are potentially more than others, and those people are protectors, but in the wrong circumstances, they also are predators on us.
Jim Fallon's a neuroscientist at UC Irvine. His TED Talk is worth seeing in full. You can find it at TED.com. On this week's episode, we're talking about the violence within us. And for Leslie Morgan Steiner, it wasn't some abstract thing. Violence was real, and it took a long time for her to figure that out. Here's how she started her TEDx talk in Seattle.
I was 22. I'd moved to New York City for my first job as a writer and editor at 17 magazine. I had my first apartment, my first little green American Express card, and I had a very big secret.
That secret will become clear a little later. So at the time, Leslie was living in New York. She just graduated from college, and she was starting out her life, and she met someone.
I met Connor on a cold, rainy January night. He sat next to me on the New York City subway, and he started chatting me up. He told me two things. One was that he, too, had just graduated from an Ivy League school, and that he worked at a very impressive Wall Street bank. But what made the biggest impression on me that first meeting was that he was smart and funny. And he looked like a farm boy. He had these big cheeks, these big apple cheeks, and this wheat blonde hair, and he seemed so sweet.
You say that he did something very smart.
He did so many things that were really smart. He was a very, very smart person, perhaps the smartest man I've ever known. He worshipped me. He thought I was so smart, that I had this great job at 17 magazine, that I was passionate about helping teenage girls. I had never had anybody feel like that about me.
Connor believed in me as a writer and a woman in a way that no one else ever had. And he also created a magical atmosphere of trust between us by confessing his secret, which was that as a very young boy, starting at age 4, he had been savagely and repeatedly physically abused by his stepfather. And the abuse had gotten so bad that he had had to drop out of school in 8th grade, even though he was very smart. And he'd spent almost 20 years rebuilding his life, which is why that Ivy League degree and the Wall Street job and his bright, shiny future meant so much to him.
And I still don't know to this day if he intentionally was trying to deceive me or if he really felt that too. It felt real at the time. And I completely fell for it.
Which brings us back to Leslie's secret, the one she talked about on the TED stage.
My secret was that I had this gun, loaded with hollow point bullets, pointed at my head by the man who I thought was my soulmate, many, many times. The man who I loved more than anybody on earth held a gun to my head and threatened to kill me more times than I can even remember.
But in the beginning, you had no idea he would turn violent.
Right. His behavior showed no anger or even frustration. He was very sweet and thoughtful and gentle for almost the first 2 years of our relationship.
I didn't know that the first stage in any domestic violence relationship is to seduce and charm the victim. Now, Connor did not come home one day and announce, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff has been great, but I need to move into the next phase where I isolate you and I abuse you. So I need to get you out of this apartment where the neighbors can hear you scream and out of this city where you have friends and family and coworkers who can see the bruises. Instead, Connor came home one Friday evening and he told me that he had quit his dream job. And he just wanted to get out of this city and away from his abusive, dysfunctional family and move to a tiny town in New England. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was leave New York. But I thought you made sacrifices for your soulmate. So I agreed, and Connor and I left Manhattan together. I had no idea that I was walking headfirst into a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap.
When did it begin? When did the violence begin?
The actual violence began 5 days before our wedding. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. I was trying to finish up a freelance writing assignment so that we would have some money for our honeymoon. And I got frustrated because my computer wouldn't work. And he got angry because I was angry. And he put his hands around my neck, squeezed really tightly, and used the chokehold to hit the back of my head up against the wall repeatedly. And he held me for a long time. I had 10, bruises on my neck from his fingers. And it was pretty scary. I was just so confused and scared and didn't know where to turn and I had no realization that this was going to be a pattern.
But then it happened a few days later.
It happened again almost immediately on our honeymoon, which it just broke a little piece of my heart. I was trying to find a secret beach, and I got lost. And he got angry, and he punched the side of my head so hard that the other side of my head hit the driver's side window. And then, a few days later, driving home from the honeymoon, he got angry again, and he threw a cold Big Mac at my face as I was driving. I mean, is that domestic violence? I didn't know anything could be so bizarre.
So, why did Leslie stay? That answer in a moment, here on the TED Radio Hour from NPR. It's the TED Radio Hour from NPR. I'm Guy Raz. And on the show today, we're talking about the violence within us. And we've been hearing Leslie Morgan Steiner's story. She tells it on the TED stage and in her book, Crazy Love. And she writes about her first marriage to a man named Connor. And it was a marriage that was defined by violence, and how Leslie says she actually got used to it.
Why did I stay? The answer is easy. I didn't know he was abusing me. Even though he held loaded guns to my head, pushed me downstairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask, because we victims know something you usually don't. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose.
How did you do it? How did you leave?
You know, in some ways, he left me no choice. I gave him an ultimatum that if he kept on abusing me, I would leave. So I drew a line in the sand. And I really meant it. And he didn't for 6 months. But then one night, again, he did. And I knew with the first punch, the marriage was over. But what I didn't realize was that maybe my life was going to be over. That he was so angry and so full of rage. The beating went on for a very long time, for hours. I tried really hard to get him to stop, and I think I was making headway when I got very lucky in that a neighbor who had heard the fight banged really, really hard on our apartment door. And that really broke the spell for Connor. And somehow Connor realized what he was doing, and he started crying, and he stopped beating me and kicking me and breaking things over my head, and he got his coat and his keys and he left. And I called the police, and I never went back to him.
Have you talked to him since you split up?
I haven't talked to him in 20 years. I think I couldn't talk to him today without shaking. And he called me once a year after we got divorced. And it was a very brief conversation, and I have not heard from him or seen him since then. And one of my most sincere wishes in this lifetime is to never, ever see him again.
We tend to stereotype victims as grisly headlines, self-destructive women, damaged goods. But since publishing Crazy Love, I have heard hundreds of stories from men and women who also got out, who learned an invaluable life lesson from what happened, and who rebuilt lives, joyous, happy lives, as employees, wives, and mothers, lives completely free of violence. Like me. Because it turns out that I'm actually a very typical domestic violence victim and a typical domestic violence survivor. I remarried a kind and gentle man, what I will never have again, ever, is a loaded gun held to my head by someone who says that he loves me. Thank you.
Would you characterize his violence as evil?
No,
No,
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't?
I think that violence sometimes is contagious. I think his stepfather was evil. He had been a little kid horribly abused, and he'd also seen his mother, who he loved so much, be abused and beaten and put in the hospital. And I think that does something to a kid. So I understood his rage. It was, in its own weird way, it was a logical response to what happened to him as a child. But that's different than evil.
In some ways, do you think both of you were victims?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I don't know if he intentionally set out to victimize me. I don't think that he did. But the thing that still baffles me is, if what he wanted was me to really love him, then why did he hurt me? Because he drove me away. He made it inevitable that I would leave at some point. That's the part that I really don't understand. I don't think it's ever a victim's fault, but I played a role in it by trying to save him, by trying to help him. In some ways, I really bought into the twisted idea that I could heal him. You could argue that that was a very seductive thing to offer him as well. You know, we both had our roles in this really twisted dance.
It's amazing when you think about human resilience, right? Because we're adaptable. We can adapt to the worst, most unbelievably violent situations and live through it.
I know we are adaptable. People say that like it's a good thing. In some ways, I think I would have been better off if I hadn't been so adaptable. If I had broken right away.
Leslie Morgan Steiner, she wrote the book Crazy Love, and you can hear her whole TED Talk at ted.npr.org. Stephen?
Oh, hi.
Is that Steve Pinker?
It is. Hi, Steve Pinker here.
How would you define violence?
I don't use a particularly exotic definition of violence, just intentional infliction of harm on a sentient creature. Or if you want, rape, homicide, assault, kidnapping, whether by an individual or by an organized group such as a government.
Stephen Pinker's a psychology professor at Harvard, and he studied violence and how common it is. And here's how he starts his TED Talk.
During the 20th century, we witnessed the atrocities of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, Rwanda, and other genocides.
Not to mention this century, Iraq, Afghanistan, Darfur, Syria.
Good morning. A masked gunman is reported
tonight. War in Mali.
Fighting has broken out once again here in eastern Congo.
This has led to a common understanding of our situation, namely that modernity has brought us terrible violence, and perhaps that native peoples lived in a state of harmony that we have departed from to our peril.
So with all this in mind, a few years ago, Stephen Pinker was researching violence, how it seemed to be everywhere, how our world seemed so violent, and he came to a startling conclusion, that it's not true.
That in fact, our ancestors were far more violent than we are, that violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and that today we are probably living in the most peaceful time in our species' existence. Now, in the decade of Darfur and Iraq, a statement like that might seem somewhere between hallucinatory and obscene, but I'm going to try to convince you that that is the correct picture.
My whole life, and your whole life, and anybody who turns on the History Channel or Discovery Channel on any given weekend will come away saying that the 20th century was the most violent in history, and that's not true.
It's not true for two reasons. One of them is that people who make that claim never look at any other century. They just say, well, there sure was a lot of violence in the 20th century,
Yeah,
which there was.
Pol Pot and Hitler.
Yes, and, Genghis Khan in the 14th century and the European wars of religion at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th. So it's just an elementary error of logic and arithmetic to say there was lots of violence in the 20th century, therefore it was the most violent century. You got to look at other centuries. And when you do, and when you scale it against the population of the world in those centuries, it's not at all clear that the 20th was the most violent. And there's a second reason why that claim is misleading, which is that it concentrates really on the first half of the 20th century, ignoring the fact that the second half of the 20th century, though it had some bad wars and atrocities too, also had a historically unprecedented development, which is that great powers and developed states stopped waging war against each other. The second half of the 20th century, these big rich countries thought the better of declaring war on each other.
The decline of violence is a fractal phenomenon. You can see it over millennia, over centuries, over decades, and over years, although there seems to have been a tipping point at the onset of the Age of Reason in the 16th century. One sees it all over the world, although not homogeneously. It's especially evident in the West, beginning with England and Holland around the time of the Enlightenment. Let me take you on a journey from several powers of 10 from the millennium scale to the year scale to try to persuade you of this. Until 10,000 years ago, all humans lived as hunter-gatherers without permanent settlements or government. And this is the state that's commonly thought to be one of primordial harmony. But the archaeologist Lawrence Keeley, looking at casualty rates among contemporary hunter-gatherers, namely, which is our best source of evidence about this way of life, has shown a rather different conclusion. Here's a graph that he put together showing the percentage of male deaths due to warfare in a number of foraging or hunting and gathering societies. The red bars correspond to the likelihood that a man will die at the hands of another man, as opposed to passing away of natural causes, in a variety of foraging societies in the New Guinea highlands and the Amazon rainforest. And they range from a rate of almost a 60% chance that a man will die at the hands of another man to, in the case of the Gabuski, only a 15% chance. The tiny little blue bar in the lower left-hand corner plots the corresponding statistic from the United States and Europe in the 20th century, and it includes all the deaths of both world wars. If the death rate in tribal warfare had prevailed during the 20th century, there would have been 2 billion deaths rather than 100 million.
But the big question is why? I mean, why is there a decline?
While we're the same biological species that we were a couple of thousand years ago, we act on our violent impulses less often. One of these historical forces, for example, is good government. A state that has a dispute resolution system will generally have lower rates of violence than if you settle your disputes like the Corleones.
We can look at the way of life of early civilizations, such as the ones described in the Bible. And in this supposed source of our moral values, one can read descriptions of what was expected in warfare, such as the following from Numbers 31. And they warred against the Midianites as the Lord commanded Moses, and they slew all the males. And Moses said unto them, Have you saved all the women alive? Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him, but all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. In other words, kill the men, kill the children. If you see any virgins, then you can keep them alive so that you can rape them. And you can find 4 or 5 passages in the Bible of this ilk. Also in the Bible, one sees that the death penalty was the accepted punishment for crimes such as homosexuality, adultery, blasphemy, idolatry, talking back to your parents, and picking up sticks on the Sabbath.
Do you think that we, like as humans, have become more peaceful? Like, are we becoming more peaceful, or is it just that we're organized better?
I think it's mostly that we're organized better. So it's not impossible that there was literal Darwinian natural selection taking place that weeded out the hotheads and the psychopaths and allowed the more peaceful, cooperative individuals to seed the next generation. And so that genes that encourage violence were selected out. I mean, it's mathematically possible. But I doubt that that was a major cause, simply because we know that rates of violence can kind of yo-yo up and down on very small timescales. If you look at something like the halving of the American homicide rate from 1992, or the transformation of Germany from the world's most warlike culture to the world's most pacifistic culture, those events occurred way too rapidly to be attributed to Darwinian natural selection, since we know that rates of violence can change for reasons other than genetic changes in our species. The simplest, most parsimonious hypothesis is that that was enough to account for all of the changes over history.
You have to admit, though, that the Germans are pretty rabid pacifists.
Yes, militant pacifists.
Whatever its causes, the decline of violence, I think, has profound implications. It should force us to ask not just why is there war, but also why is there peace? Not just what are we doing wrong, but also what have we been doing right? Because we have been doing something right, and it sure would be good to find out what it is. Thank you very much.
I think all of us have impulses or inclinations that can erupt in violence, such as revenge, exploitation of other people. So those can certainly fester inside us and lead to violence. And what we have to counteract them are other parts of the brain that implement emotions like sympathy, self-control, reason, and a sense of fairness. I think human life consists of a constant tension inside the skull between those and other components of human nature, and what erupts in actual behavior depends on the outcome of that internal struggle.
So if we're on this trajectory, right, we're heading to a great place. I mean, the end of that line is like the Garden of Eden.
I doubt it. I'm not a utopian, although I am something of an optimist. I think it's the kind of thing that you chip away at, bit by bit. I doubt that we'll ever get to a time at which rates of violence will be zero. And just as we chip away at disease and hunger and other nuisances of life, I think our species has set its ingenuity to chipping away at violence. I suspect that the long-term trajectory will continue to improve, but erratically and probably not to zero, given that some of these violent impulses are part of human nature.
Steven Pinker, he teaches at Harvard. His book on violence is called The Better Angels of Our Nature. You can see his other TED Talks, including an amazing one on language, at TED.com.
Can we all just get along? We've all been fighting far too long.
Hey, thanks for listening to the show this week. If you missed any of it, or if you want to hear more, you want to find out more about who was on it, you can visit ted.npr.org. You can also find many more TED Talks at ted.com. You can download the show through iTunes or through the NPR smartphone app. Our program was produced by Jeff Rogers, Brent Bachman, Megan Kane, Eva Grant, and Sanaz Meshkinpour, with help from Portia Robertson-Migas and Eric Newsom. Thanks to our partners at TED, Chris Anderson, June Cohen, Darren Triff, and Janet Lee. I'm Guy Raz. You've been listening to Ideas Worth Spreading here on the TED Radio Hour from NPR.
Y'all help me sing this song. Can we all just get along? We've all been fighting far too long. We all know what's right and wrong. Can we all just get along?
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.
Hi, welcome to the Subway ad for $2.99 subs. How would you like it?
I'll take Drill Sergeant, please.
You got it. All right, now listen up. I want each and every one of you to drop and give me a 6-inch meatball marinara, cold cut combo, veggie delight, or Black Forest ham on your choice of bread with any veggies you want for just $2.99 each.
Sir, yes, sir!
Subway! Make it what you want at participating restaurants. Additional charge for extras plus applicable tax. No additional discounts or coupons may be applied.